Thank you for the kind introduction. So this afternoon we've had various discussions about governance specifically. And we've been discussing it with different definitions, but specific for water governance, these are some of the keywords associated with this concept. But for this presentation, I will focus mainly on stakeholder engagement as shared by Dr. Yachi, using the point of inquiry and analysis at the local scale and the watershed scale, and specifically asking what can drive communities and stakeholders to participate in watershed governance. One bridging action has been shared by Dr. Okuda earlier, making use of the indigenous environmental indicators, the brown frog. And so from Kyoto, let me bring you to the Philippines and to Laguna Lake. This is the biggest inland water and the third largest in Southeast Asia, they say. It's much bigger than Lake Biwa, a little bigger than Lake Biwa, and it covers 61 cities and municipalities. This lake is home to more than 16 million people, with about 3 million living along the lake shore and enjoying the various ecosystem services. Just to give a quick background about the historical development in the area, there used to be lush forests and fertile lands, and during the Spanish occupation in the Philippines, this area was managed by friar groups, religious groups, and they fostered different agricultural communities until the 1900s. And from 1980s and onwards, major manufacturing industries moved their factories to this area. They developed export processing zones because it's very near Metro Manila. Road networks were developed, and there's been rapid industrialization and urbanization. And this urbanization and industrialization started in this particular watershed, which we call the Santa Rosa watershed. This is one of the 24 watersheds draining to Laguna Lake. And we see this area having a major increase in population in a span of very few years, from 570,000 people in 2007 to 800,000 in 2015. Most of the industries are said to go to this area due to the abundant water resources, specifically groundwater, being used by industrial companies and also domestic and commercial usage. So for a better visualization of the area, I will share a similar, sort of a parallel video that Okuda-san shared previously. So not to be outdone, this is also a water journey, but this time it's in Santa Rosa watershed. Pay attention to the spring. I will discuss it later. So I hope this gave you a bird's eye view, literally, of the watershed, and that you may be able to notice some differences and similarities, possibly, with the one that Ukuda-san previously showed. But you notice also we use the word "our" in this particular video, because this video has been used and presented in various stakeholder meetings and forums. So this is a way to have the community and all the stakeholders have some sort of ownership in terms of that area. But I hope that you notice is as we go from the upstream, which was sort of very green, then we go downstream and the landscape sort of changed. And we see here really as sort of the impacts of development in this area. And we see that as we go downstream, there's degradation in terms of the river systems. The scenes where you see people sort of swimming and enjoying the river is on the upper part. And that scene is actually becoming fairly a few, or it's not as common anymore. And as you go downstream, there's a lot of accumulation of waste, and see many people sort of being detached from nature. And some of the major concerns in the people and communities and even the other stakeholders there are on water quality, water supply, flooding as well. So the project started off with sort of trying to understand the state of the Santa Rosa watershed system. And we did some biodiversity and nutrient assessments. And our findings indicated and sort of provided the negative impacts of urbanization. And in this graph, you can see that biodiversity increases. Sorry. Okay. As we go from upstream is down, down here is actually upstream, and we go up to the right is the downstream. So biodiversity decreases from the upstream to the downstream, and the index in some areas are actually quite low, so the diversity is quite low in this area. Similarly, total phosphorus increased as we go downstream, and the concentrations were found. These concentrations compared to the level in Japan are way higher. So when we started having these assessments and getting these results, we found that it was sort of a bit difficult to use similar tools such as what Okuda-san previously mentioned, making use of biodiversity because, well, there's very little sort of diversity in terms of living creatures in the area, and there's been sort of a detachment of people from nature. When you ask people, some of them have not visited rivers in a while, so there's quite that detachment that we see. But we did find one exception in one community, and this is what I'm gonna share to you in a bit. So this is, I want to introduce to you to Barangay Carmen, which is a village in the middle stream of the Santa Rosa watershed. It has roughly 200 households. It's just a small rural community. And previously, farming was the main livelihood in this area. But 90% of the farmers have slowly and already sold the rights to the land to developers who want to develop it into a residential or industrial or commercial area. And most of them from farming have since moved into working in the factories and malls and driving tricycles or jeepneys, which are common transportation mode in the Philippines. And adjacent to this village, in very stark contrast to the rural area, we could see a neighboring community, which is we call it a gated community, which is actually sort of high-end, rich people owning posh houses with gates, and no one can enter it per se. You have to have some kind of pass or something. We have a highway just outside this village when you go out to the street, and also sprawling malls. So it's quite a contrast. But this village is actually adjacent to a spring, and which is used for various purposes, such as drinking, minor subsistence, for recreation. But basically, this spring is considered a sacred place because many religious people come here to visit and pray in this area, and they believe that the water has healing powers. A few years ago, the community set up ecotourism facilities in this area, and they're able to use a portion of the entrance fees collected to fund their annual cultural activities in the town fiesta. And it will happen next week. So our research documents the formation of a local group called S-Carmen, which is a Filipino acronym to mean a group of people with the objective of raising awareness and respect for Malindig River. This local group started as guides and the source of information, and they were assistants to the researchers who were undertaking biodiversity assessments. They helped in sorting zoobenthos, identifying all these creatures, and providing sort of the knowledge that is needed by the researchers as well. During the process of assisting in this research, some of the members of the community expressed interest in appreciation for the living creatures they were able to discover during the research, and also their desire to conserve Malindig Spring. So with the help of Laguna Lake Development Authority, which is a government partner of the project, a group was organized composed of youth, women, and village officers. It is still a fairly new group, maybe formally organized a year ago. They are trying to address currently very solid and domestic issues within the village, as there are no sewage systems and there's a lack of solid waste policies. They are lobbying for the creation of ordinances and have undertaken various activities such as tree planting and river rehabilitation with the neighboring rich community, Ayala West Grove, and some students from a neighboring high school in that area. They've also undertaken cleanup drives. And they have taken on the stewardship role of conservation of Malindig Spring. This guardian role, or stewardship role, was seen very, very recently, and it's been showcased because a few months ago, there was a major construction of a highway, and it ran through the village and also ran through the river area. And because of that, sediments from this construction flowed down to the river and nearly covered the spring. And when the community discovered this, most of them were like in tears and like saying, "What happened? You know, we have to do something." And S-Carmen was sort of instrumental in trying to organize a signature campaign so that developers to ask the developers to mitigate this degradation. And they were very successful in terms of asking. One time, the developers came and together with some other partners, such as the Laguna Lake Development Authority, some local officials of government, and also some other stakeholder groups, and they were able to do some sort of rehabilitation for the spring. And you can see in the picture, in the lower picture, this was sort of what happened from very, very, dark and muddy. This is the actual spring, but a week after that rehabilitation, it went back to sort of a clear and clean, bubbling spring again. But even up to now, this group has been doing some ongoing lobbying and negotiation to ensure protection of the spring. To wrap up this section on the community level, we note that Malindig Spring itself sort of acted as an environmental icon. And by definition, this icon is defined by Sato, that it can symbolize ecosystem services. It's unique and important to the local people, and that it can contribute to revitalization of communities. Why is this so? We were able to document that these activities enhancing community social well-being due to enhancement of bonding social capitals through the fiesta cultural activities brought about by the linkage between the spring and the funds that they were able to generate it through the town fiesta, as well as the conservation activities that they were able to make. Furthermore, we also noticed enhanced bridging social capital when we see that Carmen Village and also the S-Carmen group were able to link up with other stakeholders in the network, specifically the Laguna Lake Development Authority. We saw them building the relationship with the local government, and also specifically the gated communities as well, and also the Santa Rosa Watershed Management Council, which is the other level. They were able to reach out to all of them and help them and get them to sort of join in their conservation activities. But tellingly, the threats arising from development remain, and the community systems need to be able to adapt and deal with this. And the interaction at different levels, we believe, are important, as community action alone will not be enough. This community is also facing some land tenure issues where they don't have security in terms of where they live at any time they feel that they might be asked to move out if the development really starts happening in their particular village. Let me move quickly into the watershed level scale. We initially studied the evolution of sort of the institutions in this watershed. And we found that multi-sectoral cooperation actually started as early as 1997 when the Laguna Lake Development Authority organized river councils. They were focused on protection and rehabilitation of river systems, but a shift was observed in terms of the scale when from 2005 onwards, various researches and studies utilized the scale of the watershed as their point of inquiry. This led to what I call a profiling and characterization phase based on work done by research institutions such as RIHN. This is not the first, the ERIC project is not the first time that RIHN was in that area. They have previously done some environmental, identifying risks to environmental, ecological health risks. And other NGOs such as WWF and the University of the Philippines, Los Baños, were also doing some kind of research in this area. During this time, the cities and the municipalities started also developing their own environmental units in their structures, and a number of environmental related policies were promulgated. These profiling activities helped to make the local governments realize the importance of working together within the watershed ecosystem, and a watershed council was established in 2014. But organizational formalization took place sometime later, sometime in 2017. Up to this time, it's still a fairly new institution. The council itself is fairly new. Analysis of the stakeholder dynamics of the council revealed that initially, cooperation was lackluster, especially because of conflicts between the upstream and the downstream communities. The downstream LGUs to the right we're always because they experience flooding, we're always trying to complain and say that they assign the blame to the upstream communities. You're the ones causing the flooding in our area. And meanwhile, on the other hand, the Sinang, which is the agriculture community and its population is still quite low, really wants to transition, and they're saying that they feel it's unfair, that they are being hindered from pursuing progress and development. So there's always been some tension that existed within the council itself, and it was slow in taking off. But so we were thinking, how can we sort of enhance cooperation in this watershed? And we found out that during interview surveys, groundwater issues are regarded as a common concern, and it's relevant amongst many stakeholders because it is the only main source of water available for households, industries, and you can see thousands of deep wells all over the watershed. So we hypothesized that maybe if you use groundwater, it can function as a boundary object. So, and our strategy was to use groundwater research as a means to stimulate discussion for stakeholder cooperation. So we did groundwater assessments, and we specifically looked at nitrogen concentrations and sampled different wells across the watersheds. So the assessment results indicated that while wells sampled were well below the Philippine standards and the World Health Organization standards, except for only one, a hotspot area was found to have relatively higher concentrations and identified as a future risk. And we also did some isotope assessments, and these assessments revealed the sources to be agriculture waste and domestic waste. With these results, we organized various workshops with communities and stakeholders, the local government, NGOs, business sector, National Water Board, to try to generate joint problem solving. We designed community workshops to have some learning sessions so that trying to understand where water comes from, how it is replenished and all that. And also to be able to generate local knowledge as well. We were able to clarify different value perspectives for groundwater by different stakeholders based on these workshops, and we found that specifically the private sector, they're very interested in addressing it because of their sort of, they're being asked to do water footprints. Most of them are national, multinational companies, Coca-Cola, Toyota, many of the sort of famous brands are in this area with their factories. But what was interesting was that in all of these workshops, groundwater issues became only an entry point, and it stimulated discussion and cooperation. So it wasn't, because it wasn't, it didn't trigger conflict because it wasn't a controversial topic. Everybody sort of had different perspectives to it. And it opened the way for discussing broader issues such as land planning, river conservation, solid waste management. And we found also that mitigation actions and policy recommendations specifically to address pollution and supply is mostly at the watershed scale and not at the local scale. Because at the local level, the farmers, farmer communities have sold their lands. So, you know, even if agricultural waste was sort of the culprit, they're saying, but that's not a concern anymore. We're not farming anymore. And also that septic and sewage issues are beyond the scope of the communities. Furthermore, communities have other priorities. They're more concerned about economic system, education of their communities and all that. So it's really not a priority for them. And the other thing in these workshops that we found out was that there was interest to continue this multi-stakeholder dialogues. And also that the local government and private sector are the ones that are most eager to deal with these issues. So this generated interest to continue being engaged with all these multi-stakeholder dialogues. So one of the stakeholder groups in the watershed is the Watershed Management Council. And currently it has membership with local government units, national government agency, water service providers, and some NGOs. But when we did a stakeholder analysis, we found that this is still very much agency-led, with government doing a lot of the steering side, but that there are many other stakeholder groups that are not yet involved in this area, but are actually interested and want to be included in discussions. So discussions about having sort of a watershed forum as a platform for engagement were designed, and so that it will become more inclusive and can possibly be transformed into a much more sort of, aside from a more of centralized structure to a more network kind of structure. To jumpstart this process, the Watershed Council organized a Stakeholder Assembly last year, and there were 179 participants. These are all multi-sector, private, public, young people were there, farmer communities, fishermen, they were there. And one of the outcomes of these workshops, they were able to identify development vision for their respective communities, and policy commitments as well were generated, as well as individual level commitments. And the Barangay Carmen, Carmen people were also there to share their experiences as well. What was striking was that during the assembly, the stakeholders expressed the desire to be involved in watershed governance. And a number of them emphatically said that we want action and we want it now. So another platform that is being explored by the council is bringing the engagement to the digital level. Filipinos are very active on Facebook. We're like one of the maybe the #1 Facebook users in the world. So they want to be able to use this as a platform to generate sort of information exchange and also real engagement. And for now, it's still not yet fully, functional, but a local university, some students at the local university are trying to look into how to make this sort of an effective medium for information exchange and engagement. So what we see here is we see that this is, there's some makings of some kind of a watershed community or watershed society in this area, and that as it evolves, this is actually not purely organic in the sense that it's not a true bottom-up process. A lot of it is through the work of the Laguna Lake Development Authority, which is a government agency who've tried to reach out and look at who are the potential sort of major players in this game. And they've used that as like a bridging organization to try to really generate all the stakeholder engagement. And they're very strategic about it. And some of the factors that have helped governance in this area is the fact that this area has benefited from a lot of sort of the external support from the research institutes, the academic groups, NGOs. Donor agencies have worked in this area as well. Furthermore, we see the policy shifts in the Philippines. Recently, there's been a sort of encouragement to use land use planning based on ecosystem-based approaches. And also, watershed governance is being mainstreamed. And of course, the issue of sustainable development is being encouraged. And finally, there's been a changing discourse in the global community. Of course, sustainability is a new buzzword, the SDGs, but also the corporate social responsibility is trickling down to that area because the multinationals are based in that area and they're sort of being asked to look at their water footprints, sort of sustainability indicators as well. So these are sort of the enabling factors, and let me wrap up because my time is up. So as a sort of synthesize the discussion, basically to say that we found that the Mundig Spring was a good environmental icon and it facilitated interest of the local community in doing sort of micro watershed governance. But boundary objects, the way that we used groundwater was useful in creating entry points and allowing different levels of cooperation, even without actual consensus. I mean, the upstream still disagrees with the downstream in terms of, you know, we still want to develop and you cannot stop us and all that, but they have tried to, there's now sort of an openness in terms of discussing how to move forward. They're now talking about how to harmonize land use plans and sort of trying to learn from each other. And finally, that this watershed community, or community of practice, as I call it, is still very new, and they would need adaptive strategies to deal with sort of the rapid changes brought about by urbanization, as well as political processes. So at this time, we are not yet at the level of knowing what the impact is in terms of, has there been a change in the social-ecological systems, or sort of, but the time will tell for these things to happen. So anyway, thank you for your attention, and maybe I can open this time for question and answer.